The house of locked doors. The air was thick with dust when Michael first entered the mansion. He stood in the grand foyer, staring at the enormous chandelier hanging overhead. Its crystals, caked with years of grime, swayed ever so slightly in the draft, casting weak, scattered reflections of light across the walls. The place felt as though it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. Yet the eerie sense of being watched gnawed at the back of Michael's mind. The mansion had been left to him by a distant relative he had never met, a man named Edgar Darrow. The name meant nothing to him. He hadn't even known Edgar existed until the day the letter arrived, informing him that he was the last remaining heir to the Darrow estate. Michael thought it was a mistake at first. His family had never been wealthy, and there was no record of any extended relatives with large properties. Yet here he was, standing inside a massive, Gothic mansion that looked like it belonged in a ghost story. The letter had been simple and formal. You have inherited the Darrow mansion, the estate, and all that resides within is now yours. With that, he packed his things, driven more by curiosity than any real need for a change in his life. His apartment back in the city was small, cramped, and suffocating. This place, by contrast, seemed like an opportunity, a fresh start. But standing here now, Michael wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. The mansion was silent, save for the occasional groaning of old wood. He stepped forward, his shoes echoing loudly in the empty foyer. To his right was a large staircase, the banister intricately carved with designs that seemed to resemble twisting vines. His eyes followed the stairs up to the second floor, where shadows gathered in dark corners, concealing the upper hallways. On either side of the foyer were several heavy wooden doors, all firmly closed. Michael set his bag down near the door and took a few hesitant steps toward one of the rooms. His fingers wrapped around the brass handle of the nearest door, but when he turned it, the door wouldn't budge. Frowning, he moved to the next door. Same result. He tried all of the doors in the foyer, but every single one was locked. Puzzled, he made his way up the staircase, hoping to find an open door somewhere. The steps creaked loudly under his weight, and the air grew colder the higher he went. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw more doors, each one identical to those downstairs. One by one, he tried them, but every door was locked. Every single door.
Frustration began to simmer in his chest. What kind of mansion was this? Why would someone leave him a house if he couldn't even enter the rooms? Michael sighed and leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. Maybe there was a master key somewhere, hidden in a drawer or under a floorboard. Maybe the lawyer who handled the estate had simply forgotten to give him the key. He made a mental note to call the lawyer first thing in the morning. Just as he was about to give up and head back downstairs, he noticed one door at the very end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling through the crack. Michael's pulse quickened as he approached. This was it, the only room in the entire house that wasn't locked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small compared to the rest of the house, barely large enough to fit a single bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of mildew. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the room, yet something about it made Michael uneasy. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt wrong, like the room didn't belong in the house. As he explored, he noticed a small drawer beneath the desk. Kneeling, he tugged it open, expecting to find it empty. Instead, he found a single brass key. His heart leapt. This had to be it, the master key. He stood quickly, holding the key up to the light. It was old, tarnished with age, but still intact. Without wasting another moment, he hurried out of the room and down the hall, back to the first door he had tried earlier. With shaky hands, he slid the key into the lock and turned. The door clicked open. Michael stepped into the room beyond, and his breath caught in his throat. It was nothing like the rest of the mansion. He found himself standing in the middle of a bustling street, the sun shining brightly overhead. Cars honked as they sped by, and people hurried along the sidewalks, their faces blurred but their voices clear. It was a perfect replica of a city, one that Michael had never seen before, but somehow felt familiar. He turned around to look for the door he had come through, but it was gone. There was nothing behind him except more street. Panic gripped him. This couldn't be real. He had been in a mansion, and now, where was he? He spun in place, trying to make sense of what was happening. The people around him didn't seem to notice his presence. He called out to them, but no one responded. As he wandered the streets, confusion mounting, Michael realized that the city had no end. Every turn he made brought him back to the same street, with the same blurred faces and the same noise. Hours passed, or was it days, before he finally collapsed in exhaustion, his mind overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the city vanished. Michael was back in the mansion, standing in the exact same spot he had been before.
His body trembled, and his breathing was ragged. He clutched his head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't possible none of it was, and yet, it had felt so real. The door he had entered through stood open, as if mocking him. Michael backed away, not daring to step through it again. He glanced at the key still in his hand and quickly pocketed it. If that room led to an alternate reality, what would the other doors lead to? A part of him wanted to leave the mansion and never return, but another part, the part that had always been drawn to mystery and danger, urged him to stay. The house was trying to tell him something. It was no ordinary mansion. That much was clear. There was something inside, something waiting for him to uncover. Over the following days, Michael tried the key on every door in the mansion. Each time, the door opened to a different world. One room took him to a sprawling desert under a blood-red sky, where the bones of long-dead creatures littered the sand. Another led to a thick, suffocating jungle where strange, glowing plants grew in every direction. Each world was more bizarre than the last, and each time, Michael barely managed to return before the door closed behind him. He began to realize that the mansion wasn't a house at all, it was a gateway to infinite realities, each one more dangerous and unpredictable than the last. Some worlds were empty, desolate wastelands, while others teemed with life. But no matter where he went, one thing remained constant, the feeling that he was being watched. As the days turned into weeks, Michael's grip on reality began to slip. He lost track of time, of what was real and what was part of the mansion's twisted games. The house had become his prison, and the doors, once a source of curiosity, now filled him with dread. One night, after returning from a particularly harrowing world where the very air seemed to burn his skin, Michael collapsed in the foyer, exhausted and terrified. He couldn't keep doing this. The mansion was driving him mad. He needed to find a way out, but when he looked up, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. A door, one he had never noticed before, stood in the middle of the foyer. It was different from the others. Made of black, polished wood, it seemed to absorb the light around it. The brass handle glistened invitingly, as though daring him to open it. Michael knew that whatever lay beyond that door would be the end of him. He had seen enough to know that some doors were better left unopened. Yet, as he stared at the door, something deep inside him stirred. Curiosity, desperation, a need for answers. With trembling hands, he took the key from his pocket and approached the door. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the key into the lock. The door opened, and Michael stepped inside.